She was energetic. She was very creative. She was someone who I think reminded me of myself really a lot at her age. She was looking to develop and find her voice. Plus she was interested in documentaries, which my own background is in documentaries.
I met Heather in high school. I met her when I moved to Montgomery County, Maryland. She was one of the first people that I actually met. Just met her in passing in the hallway. And then we were in a play together, and that's how we really became acquainted.
Here's this tiny little thing that first go in, and of course Mama's there and the baby's been brought up for the first time. I stick my arms out to go pick her up and watch up. Careful, careful, you'll break. Oh, I said, I didn't break the others. How am I going to break this one? So I picked her up and held her, I guess, for an hour or so before I gave her back to Mama.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Pod and the Pendulum, the horror movie podcast that is covering every horror movie franchise, a movie in an episode at a time. I'm your host, Mike Snoonian, joined once again by my co-host, Jerry Smith. Jerry, how are we feeling tonight?
I'm doing great. I revisited the Blair Witch Project last night for the only fourth time in my life, and yeah, same result.
Yeah, same result. Still pants shitting scary at times.
Dude, no, honestly, my wife was laughing the entire time because we set the projector downstairs, and I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time. She's like, "What is wrong with you? Like, what is up with you? You write about horror movies for a living." I was like, "I don't know, dude. I held my bladder all night because I didn't want to go downstairs and pee." Excellent.
That's why you got to keep that spare Mountain Dew bottle by the bed every now and then. We actually did a screening of it 2 Octobers ago when we first moved in to our house. We really wanted to do a screening in the woods, but just could not get it together. So we did like a backyard screening in a fairly wooded area, and we watched it outside with a bunch of friends projected. And I remember like that night my wife was like, we're in our bedroom, and she's like, I think I see something in the backyard, and there's no fucking way I'm going back there. So we just like time to lock all the doors.
See,
all
like,
right.
What's interesting really quickly is watching it last night, especially after that long 3+ hour episode, which like I said in the episode, by the end of the episode, I realized that I don't only love this movie, but I consider it probably one of the best movies ever. And I'm going to try not to gush on this episode because we have, a special guest. But man, last night just cemented that. Like, it just hits on every aspect.
Absolutely. So tonight we are actually joined for a little bit of a bonus episode here. Before we move on to Book of Shadows, we have a couple interviews lined up right now, and we're really excited basically to be speaking with Ben Rock, who is the man behind a lot of the mythology of the Blair Witch, and pretty much I would call him the hype man, pretty much the person who I think his work got a lot of people kind of into the theaters. He's the writer and director of the
I wouldn't call myself that. Go on.
I would. Well, I'm the host, so I'm calling you that.
Fair enough.
Damn it, it's my show. All right, we'll edit that part out where I cursed out the guests.
It's all you can curse me out. It's really fun.
Fair enough. So he is the writer-director behind the mini documentary "The Curse of the Blair Witch," as well as the Burkittsville 7 and Shadow of the Blair Witch. He's also responsible for the Shudder exclusive podcast, The Video Palace, which is super fun. If you guys haven't listened to that yet, it is like an audio drama that is like really scary. It's for those of us that grew up in the VH generation. It's a lot of fun. Cannot recommend that enough for a binge listen. Jerry, I already know how you're doing. Jerry, Ben, how are we doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Doing awesome. Chasing after a 16-month-old all day. It was a lot of fun.
That's great. So he's walking now?
Oh, yes. Yes, walking a lot.
That's when it gets terrifying and not as much fun.
Walking and then running. I don't know. Is it ever nothing will ever be more terrifying than clipping his fingernails when he was 2 months old. Nothing. I only drew blood once. My wife drew blood once and said, fuck this, I'm not doing this anymore. And so it became my responsibility. I drew blood once and freaked out and almost took him to the hospital. And ever since then, I've just, it's like being a negative cutter. Measure twice, cut once. Like if you're not sure that you can make the clean cut on the fingernail, just don't do it. But now that he's 16 months old, also, it's, it's a much larger target than, like a 3-month-old.
I remember when our daughter was like about 16 months old, my wife and I were celebrating our anniversary, and my mom was watching Ada that afternoon. I remember we got a call. I don't want to worry you, but Ada has a carrot stuck up her nose right now, and I think you should come get her. And we had to take her to like the emergency room to extract a piece of carrot
my God.
on our wedding anniversary. So that was super fun.
My son got an entire crayon up his nose. Like the entire thing. Yeah, it's brutal.
It is. All right.
Yes.
So we could do a whole podcast on horror movie parenting, and I think I kind of want to do that at some point. But
That's a good
idea.
I digress. I think so. I think if I could find the time, I would do that. So, Ben, we know your time is precious, so we want to just jump right in if that.
Oh, not anymore. I can go all night now.
Anyway.
All right. Well, I need to get to work tomorrow morning and tell a bunch of 8th grade girls that 8th grade boys are the fucking worst. So that's pretty much
fair. You're not wrong, by the way.
Oh my God, if I was ever right about one thing, it's that.
I was a substitute teacher for like 5 years, and I steered way clear of middle school. Oh God.
Oh jeez.
The worst people alive.
If I say I agree, I feel like it would get back to my school somehow, and I would get fired. So
please don't. Yeah, you should correct me. I'm way off base, and I just don't see their inner light. But also being a substitute teacher, like you kind of see the worst in all the students.
Yeah, that is hell. So how did you first get together with Eduardo Sanchez, Daniel Myrick, and Greg Hale? Like, what brought you guys together?
Well, we all went to college together in Orlando, Florida in the 90s. So there were, at the time, actually they're all still there. There were at least 3 film programs in Orlando because the film industry was sort of pretending to move to Orlando a little bit. So you had Universal Studios Florida getting, they just opened, and Disney MGM Studios, which I don't know if it's still Disney MGM. And there were some other. There had always been a small production base there. There's actually a huge production base. 4 hours south in Miami Beach. But they were trying to hype it up. So 3 film schools opened. Valencia Community College, which is now Valencia College, they started a program that was all technical. Full Sail, which is still there and is still Full Sail, and is a very a lot of students come out of there. I worked on a project a few years ago, and like 2/3 of the crew were Full Sail grads. So
it's the home base for NXT, the WWE's developmental territory. They do a show there every week. Yep.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah, like Darren Lynn Bousman came out of there, and there's Stephen C. Miller came out of there. Like it's legit. I'm not down on Full Sail. A lot of people who I knew back in the day are now teaching there. And then the other program was at the time Full Sail was not a bachelor's program. Now it is. And so the University of Central Florida had a bachelor's degree program. So sorry, it's a very long answer to your question, but right out of high school, I was a terrible student. I went to Valencia Community College and actually turned out to be a pretty good student when I was paying for it. And then I applied, got in and went through their film program, which is just a 1-year kind of certificate program after I got my associate's degree, so I could transfer to, a 4-year college after that. But I kind of took a 1-year a 1-year cul-de-sac of the certificate program to kind of learn all the technical arts of film. So at Valencia, you learned grip, camera, sound, electric, production, art department, that kind of stuff. And one of the students there, who was a little bit older than all of us, was Greg Hale. And I remember one day our teacher, Michael Corbett, said, like, hey, everybody, if you've made a film, tomorrow, let's watch them. And so we all brought like VHS tapes, and I had this thing that I'd made when I was 19 called No Subtlety that was shot on VHS. And I was very proud of it. And we all had something like that. None of it was all that great. And then Greg put in a film that he had made on black and white Super 8 called Perpetual Motion. And it was like, holy shit, that's a real filmmaker. Like we're all pretending, and this guy's for real. And Greg was, I was 19 or 20. Greg was probably 25. He'd been in the Army. He'd kind of lived a little bit of a life, and he also was part of the crew that had built Universal Studios Florida, like in the art department kind of thing. So after Valencia, or like while I was at Valencia, I applied to 2 schools, Cal Arts, which I didn't get into, and UCF, which I did, which was convenient because that meant I didn't have to move to Valencia, California at the time. And I knew people at UCF, and UCF was a tiny program. There were like only 30 students accepted per year. And so Greg and I both applied, and we both got in, and we were in the 3rd year of that program. In the first year of that program were Ed and Dan. And I had gotten to know Dan because I was a makeup artist from back in high school even, but I wanted to do special effects makeup, but there really weren't that many makeup artists kicking around the film school scene. And Dan was making a film at UCF called Sarah's Morning that Ed was DP on. And if you look it up on YouTube, I think you can probably find Sarah's Morning. I think it would terrify Dan to know that people were watching it. But I remember like going to their set at the Valencia program. We had 30 people and big cameras and trucks and stuff, and we kind of got it in our heads that like this is the only way to make a movie. And then I went to work on this UCF project for Dan, doing makeup for him, and it was like 4 people in a tiny light kit and a camera, an Arri S camera, which I think is actually from World War II, and I was like, this isn't going to look like anything. How can this look good? You don't even have any giant trucks or 12K lights or whatever. And then when I saw the finished product, I was like, holy crap, you don't need all that much stuff. But that was where I met Ed and Dan on that shoot. Mike Manello was in the same class with them, and I met him when I was at UCF. And he also went on, he was the guy who created Video Palace, so he brought me on to Video Palace. And but he was also the co-producer on the Blair Witch Project. And when you talk about the hype man for the Blair Witch Project, I actually think that credit should go to Mike. Mike was the one who convinced everyone to set up the website that put the content that I had helped to create onto the website. Mike was the one who came up with that. Mike was the one who'd had experience in marketing and used a lot of guerrilla tactics then, and full-time professionally for a living now does guerrilla tactics for giant big studio projects and stuff.
So when did someone have the idea? Because I think one of the things about the Blair Witch Project is it gets credited as perhaps being the first movie to really take advantage of the internet in terms of marketing. When did the idea come up to say, like, we have this new tool at our disposal, how do we make the best use of it?
Okay, so I wasn't working in the Haxon offices, but they had an office. It was a house they were renting in downtown Orlando, and they had a contract making videos that would like go on the screens in Planet Hollywood and stuff. And so they were able to support their Blair Witch making habit by editing those videos. And Mike was the one, he had been the marketing director of the Florida Film Festival and of the Enzion Theater, which both of those things figure prominently into the Blair Witch story as well. But Mike had been the one that convinced the Enzion to put up a website, I believe, for the first time when he was a marketing director there, and the same for the Florida Film Festival. So Mike has kind of told me the story that it's a longer answer to a short question, but the pitch reel that we had made, this is kind of jumping a little bit forward in the story, but you can find all this stuff. The pitch reel that we had made, that I had written, that was the first thing that I did on it, that had gotten into the hands of John Pearson. So John Pearson was a very prominent indie producer and producer's rep in the 90s. He discovered Spike Lee and Michael Moore and Kevin Smith, and he's a humongous, towering figure in indie cinema in the 90s.
And he had a
His book
show
is
on.
great.
Yeah, Spike, Mike, Slackers, and Dykes. Yeah, he's awesome. I think he's a college professor now. So John Pearson had a show on IFC. I think it was either IFC or Bravo called Split Screen, and they had run our kind of pitch reel on their thing, and they had a website with a chat board. And, it's like early days of the internet. And so many people, after they saw this thing, hopped on his chat board that it crashed his chat board. And it kept doing it over and over again. And so he reached out, I think, to Mike or to someone from the Haxon group and said, you guys need to set up your own chat board because you're crashing mine. Like, I don't want to host your content here. You got to do this. And I think that was sort of the last straw. But I believe Mike had been kind of pushing for some kind of internet presence up until then, and like, I don't even know if I had an email account at that time. I probably did. If I did, it would have been like an AOL account. Like, we weren't all on the internet. Like, it really was kind of a new technology that, some people had embraced, but most people, my father wasn't on the internet yet. Like, a lot of people are like, what's the point? And they learned, but they hadn't gotten there yet.
So what was it like for you then when, like you had said, like when message boards start to talk about this, when it gets a presence, what was it like to at least hear about this kind of reaction from either, fans of the movie that's coming out to, when you hear people are trying to quote unquote solve the mystery of what happened to Heather, Josh, and Mike? What was it like to kind of hear that secondhand or just discover that was going on?
Again, because the internet wasn't like a big thing. Like, if you told me that there was like a huge incident on, TikTok or Snapchat, I'd be like, oh, that's neat. But I'm not on those platforms, so I wouldn't really know the gravity of that today. So the fact that it was like a big deal on the internet, I think I really only used the internet like for email at the time. Wikipedia didn't exist. The Internet Movie Database, like, there wasn't much on the internet. It's hard to imagine. Amazon.com. I had bought some stuff on Amazon. But there really wasn't that much. So to me, when I realized the power of it was more like when I heard that, like, there, because we're all in Orlando at this point, that I think it was K-Rock, the LA radio station, had spent like 5 or 10 minutes of morning drive time talking about this website that they found, and was this stuff real? And I was like, oh, like it was kind of rippling back at us. But like, by the time the website was up, we were well on our way towards, like, I couldn't tell you the exact timeline of it. Mike Manello could, but I would say we were on the road to Sundance. Like, we were already kind of a known thing floating around in the world, which means the movie was long in the rearview mirror. Like, the website was not up when we were making the movie. And so my involvement, I would say, starts in, like 1996, when I wrote the, what you would call today the sizzle reel or the pitch tape. When I wrote that and kind of did a bunch of research and created a bunch of stuff. And I did that. And then sort of ends around the time the film is finished being shot, which is, Halloween of 1997 was our last shoot day. And then we actually had to do some pickups the next night. So November 1st, 1997. And then it was kind of in Ed and Dan's hands. And there was, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there was a phase 2. So the original concept for the movie was that experts would be analyzing the footage that was found in the woods, kind of in search of style. And so there were a few shoots for phase 2. Some of them made their way into Curse of the Blair Witch, like the Mysterious Occurrences thing, kind of the 1970s paranormal documentary looking piece, was one of the things. And even though they shot it, they brought him back. There was a private investigator named Buck Buchanan, who, that was his real name. I found him. And you can tell how far I went into the yellow pages to find someone whose last name was B. But he was a cool guy. And they shot some stuff for phase 2, and then they ended up not using it, but they ended up bringing him back and interviewing him for Curse of the Blair Witch.
And anyway, go ahead.
So phase 2 was post getting picked up by Artisan and having a little bit more.
No. Phase 2 was always the plan. So phase 1 we shot in October, and then phase 2 was sort of like kind of catch as catch can after that, and that was going to be the whole movie. Honestly, probably the biggest part of phase 2 that kind of made it out into the world was the Rustin Parr jailhouse interview. So that was a phase 2 thing, and so I was around for a little bit of that stuff, but not much. Because they really didn't have any money at all. Like it was basically being done, with the dregs of the tiny budget that we'd already had, and that budget was only like $22,000 or $25,000 to make the thing that really is the movie as it was released.
Well, speaking on that real quick, I mean, the shape of the film, eventually changed from, what you're saying, more of like the documentary in search of kind of angle to what the found footage thing that we eventually received. Having written a lot of that mythology, how involved were you in kind of helping decide what worked and what didn't? Did you have any hand in that?
I had literally no hand in the editing. That was all Ed and Dan. I was there a lot. In fact, like I shot a short film right before I moved to LA in 1998 called The Meeting, and they let me edit it at Hacks and Films. So I was literally like, they were editing Blair Witch on it was a Media 100, on the exact same Media 100 that I was editing this short on at night. Like I'd come in at 11 o'clock at night and edit for 3 hours and go home and wake up and do it again. So I was around, and also, when I said earlier that the Enzian Theater and the Florida Film Festival factor into this, I was a manager and a projectionist at the Enzian Theater back then. And what that meant was, because it was then and probably still is now kind of a very family-run, owned and operated kind of a arts place. They were actually cool with me doing a screening on Saturday morning of like in LA, I would murder to have something like this. I could go in Saturday morning, our first screening wasn't until like 2 or 3 or whatever. I could have people come in at 10 in the morning and I could run a screening. As long as I cleaned up afterwards, everything was cool. So the first cut of the movie, which was like 2.5 hours long, they brought, a digibeta deck over to the Enzian, and we set it up, and we had an audience of people.
Oh, wow.
And I gave feedback then, and I gave feedback, and a lot of other people gave feedback. And actually, it was at that first screening that they met Kevin Fox, and Kevin Fox ended up coming on board to be an executive producer, and he was an LA-based producer who was in Orlando actually making a film at the Valencia film program at the time. But he had connections to, people with money and agencies and lawyers and stuff like that. And he was able to kind of connect them to a lot of places and people that they wouldn't have had connections to. And he saw the potential in the movie immediately and kind of, hitched his wagon to it.
So what did you see in that 2.5 hour cut that worked and that you were were able to take from when you put together the Curse of the Blair Witch? Like what jumped out? The Rustin Parr stuff was in there, I take it.
No, none of it was. The 2.5 hour cut, the 2.5 hour cut literally was just the three actors in the woods, an hour more of it than what you've seen in the movie. And it was like, it's funny because after we shot the movie, I actually remember standing in the parking lot of the Enzian Theater and talking to Greg Hale about it and saying, I think what we shot in the woods can be the movie. Like, I think that there's a whole movie in that. And he was like, I don't know. And I'm like, no, I really think that there's something there. And when I remember watching the 2.5 hour one and being like, well, I guess I was wrong about that. Because it was a lot of Heather pointing her camera at dead, wet leaves while she walked around complaining about stuff, or Josh getting into screaming matches with people or whatever, and it was overlong. It seems self-evident to me today that if you're going to make a horror movie, I'm not saying you can't make a long horror movie. There's some super long horror movies that I love, but I sort of feel like you get 90 minutes. The audience is going to give you 90 to 100 minutes. And if you're making The Shining, they'll give you some more. but most horror movies, no matter how awesome, tend to live in that zone. I don't know how long John Carpenter's The Thing is, but I bet it's not 3 hours long. You know, it's and I should know because I've seen that movie about 1 billion times, but I would bet it's in the 2-hour neighborhood, maybe a little bit shorter. But 2.5 hours is a long time to watch found footage. And yeah, you know, I mean, it wasn't a finished cut. It was a, hey, let's see what's working and what's not working cut. And you know, they went and they shaved, you know, an hour out of it. And at that point, it was pretty tight. There's sometimes online people will talk about how they want Ed to go in, because Ed's threatened to do this, to go in and make a longer cut of it, because you certainly could. You know, I'm of the opinion that the cut that's out there is the best cut. And I'm sure you could go into the raw footage of, you know, Citizen Kane or Star Wars and make a better movie than the one that got released. But I sort of feel like, to what end? Like, just kind of like it worked. It worked for audiences. It's excellent. No reason to go in and, you know, with different eyes as a different person 20 years later, more than 20 years later, and play with it again. I don't know that you get a movie that's so much better that it commands a need to watch it. But I've never spoken to Ed about this, and maybe he has designs that I don't know.
Definitely ask him next week when we talk to him. But it's funny though, because this is a true director's cut. Like, what you see in theaters is a director's cut. It's what they ended up putting in. So it's not like they were forced to take stuff out. Like, no, they, you know, from, you know, what I've read, like, have really took a hatchet to it and cut it to the bone, to the point where they had to make the credits longer in order to get, like, designated as a feature film, because they had cut so much of it. It was under the running time of what would be, quote unquote, considered a feature.
Well, I think that cutting it down to the bone was the right call with that, because, because I mean, even cutting down to the bone, to me, it's so overwhelmingly a character piece. And I think the longer it is, the more as an audience, you want the thing as a horror audience that could not be satisfactory. Like, if the Blair Witch showed up out of a beam of light and hovered in the, you know, in the house and, you know, rode around on a broom, no matter how you showed the Blair Witch, it would have sucked. There's no satisfying way to look at it. And so I feel like the longer it gets, the more you're kind of making the promise that you're going to get that. And you know, some people at the time and you know, even today, find the movie frustrating because you really don't see anything. But I mean, like, there are always those movies, like, you know, Robert Wise's The Haunting is the one that I always kind of cite, where, you know, they remade it. Jan de Bont remade it in 1999, same year we came out, and you know, showed everything. But the original Robert Wise, The Haunting, you don't really see anything, and it's terrifying.
Well, it leaves it up to the imagination. And watching the Blair Witch Project last night, like, that was one of the many things I wrote down in notes. Is like, it works so well, and I wouldn't change a single thing about it. I wouldn't want it any longer. I think it's perfect the way it is, and not showing the witch and leaving everything up to the imagination is what made it so terrifying to me.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't think that there's a visual representation, and I'm not gonna really criticize the Adam Wingard 2016 movie because I overwhelmingly liked it. But I feel like they felt like they needed to show a little something, and I feel like it actually didn't help. Like, I feel like I didn't feel like, oh, finally we get to see what the Blair Witch looks like. It's not. It's a different time. You know, there was a time where every Friday the 13th movie, I couldn't wait to see Jason Voorhees' mask come off so I could see, you know, whatever continuity be damned makeup effect they'd slapped on Kane Hodder's face. But I don't really feel like we're in that moment right now. You know, like a movie like The Witch. I love The Witch. I saw it twice in the theater, and I bought the Blu-ray, and I don't really buy a lot of Blu-rays. And, it's a movie where you see enough to feel satisfied, but you also, again, you don't get to see the face of the devil or something like that. And I don't know. I mean, it's a tough line to walk, because also, John Carpenter's The Thing is, not just one of my favorite horror movies, but one of my favorite movies, period. And that movie shows you fucking everything all the time.
To me, a character piece like the Blair Witch, what works about it is, because I don't see anything, I get to imagine a lot more. And, that drive home, coming home from the theater and walking into my place, afterwards, your mind gets to go places and your mind gets to turn things over. And that to me is a lot scarier than anything that, like, here's a makeup effect. Like,
Well, what's great about it is, I mean, just in my opinion, the film's not about the Blair Witch. I mean, it's about Heather, Josh, like it is very much a character piece,
Agreed.
and I think that's what you need to focus on. And I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't agree more. What I do want to ask is, and we started the conversation before we hit record by talking a little bit about what scared us as kids. And in part, this movie works so well is because the story of Ellie Kedward and everything that follows in the mythology, it's so much like the stories that like we would tell each other around campfires growing up, or like when we're tucked into bed when our grandparents are trying to get us to go to sleep and behave.
Yeah.
What specific bits of like folklore and legend did you take growing up and tried to like interpose that into the mythology you had come with when working with these guys on the movie?
Well, I mean, every ghost story that ever kind of crawled under my skin, like this is goofy, and I've never really spoken about this, but like when I went to high school, there was supposedly a guy who haunted the theater that I was part of the drama club, and there was a guy named Tommy who supposedly had hanged himself in the 1970s, and his ghost was in the theater. And what kind of stuck with me was actually, you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 totally different stories of Tommy, and that was, a very localized folklore of, the Winter Park High School, thespian troupe 850, Ann Derflinger auditorium lore that matters nothing to anyone outside of that group. But then like my fascination with that kind of stuff started, honestly, even before that, like when I was a little kid, and I would read books about ghosts and hauntings and stuff like that. And I always found it fascinating. And I think, part of me, the part of me that used to believe in it is gone. I don't believe anything anymore, but, probably the biggest one was the Bell Witch from Adams, Tennessee. And that was the one where, like, when Greg Hale at his house said to me, like, hey, have you ever heard of the Blair Witch? And I said, you mean the Bell Witch? Like, I thought he got it wrong. The Bell Witch is like a famous haunting, and it's a terrifying story when you read it. But again, there are, varying accounts, and depending on who you're hearing the account from, it changes the whole story around. And so one of the things that I very consciously did, not just in when I was working on the Blair Witch stuff, but like in anything I do that kind of has an underlying mythology, and we did this big time in Video Palace, is you don't give everyone the same story. There isn't a canon to it. There's kind of, we're kind of circling around a very similar story, but that was why, again, not to jump forward, but like when I got my opportunity to direct kind of a piece of Blair Witch lore, the biggest one being the Burkittsville 7 for Showtime, I decided to take the most current piece of it prior to the Blair Witch Project movie disappearances, which was the Rustin Parr murders in the 1940s, and come up with a crank who said Rustin Parr didn't kill anybody. And to me, that kind of hits at the heart of folklore, even modern folklore. Is it's like, okay, we're all getting this Blair Witch, endorphin rush out of saying that Rustin Parr killed these kids because an old woman ghost told him to do it. Blah blah blah. What if he? We've seen the footage of him being interviewed. He's clearly not all there. What if this guy was manipulated by a crazy person to say the things he said? and there's a more rational explanation, but the rational explanation is that the oldest kid killed all the other kids. To me, that was even more terrifying. And but and not that anyone has ever asked me to make a Blair Witch sequel, but we had talked before Blair Witch 2 was made. There were conversations about making basically an origin story of Blair Witch. So it'd be it honestly would have been. I flatter any of us to say it would have been like The Witch, but it would have been like a witch story of that period, or it would have been a supernatural story in that period. So obviously it wouldn't be a found footage film. It would be, kind of an original narrative story, kind of that, feels stark and frozen in the winter. And, all to me, a lot of the things that signified the first movie, which were kind of isolation and kind of the destruction and betrayal that happens, among three people when they become increasingly desperate. But it would have been over the course of Blair Township in that time. And my pitch at the time, and again, this movie's probably never going to get made, but my pitch at the time was we should show Ellie Kedward getting killed at the beginning and then never come back to her. We should make it clear that it wasn't Ellie Kedward, that Ellie Kedward had nothing to do with any of this. This is something this is like the Bermuda Triangle. It's just out there. You can put a name on it all you want.
Interesting. And that's kind of the route that Wingard and Barrett went with overall. I always, when I watch the 2016 Blair Witch, I think of that area. I live in something called the Bridgewater Triangle, where there's Bigfoot sightings and pterodactyls and haunted burial grounds, satanic areas. And it's they treat it like that, where it's not necessarily a witch, but this really just messed up patch of land where bad things happen.
That's cool.
So I love that idea. And not ever coming back to Ellie Kedward, would you have explored what it is at that point down the road, or would you decide nope, it's still going to keep it mysterious?
I think that you could do both. I think that the stupid version of it is kind of the Pet Cemetery route. I'm not saying Pet Cemetery is stupid. I love Pet Cemetery, but I'm saying the ancient burial ground, the indigenous whatever. But it was even in one of the Blair Witch PC games at the time that the Native Americans in that area had a name for this thing. I forget what they called it. But I like the idea that it's a cursed place rather than than we vilify this witch. And I think it makes for a more nuanced scary experience. It makes for more suspense and more tension, because it's not like you can just vanquish this witch, and any more than you could vanquish, again, the Bermuda Triangle. I remember when, because I was a consultant on Blair Witch 2. That was the extent of my involvement in Blair Witch 2. But I remember I was a consultant on everything to do with Blair Witch. So there was a series of young adult novels, and Dave Stern wrote some books, and then there were the video games, and then there was Blair Witch 2. And I remember Joe Berlinger really wanted to set it in Baltimore. And he said, couldn't it follow them home? And I'm like, could the Bermuda Triangle follow you home? It's not the way it works. But, and I don't think it was a giant rewrite in their script to say, oh, he's got some weird warehouse in Burkittsville or whatever.
Well, it's funny. I made a note here when I rewatched Shadow of the Blair Witch, I'm not a fan of Book of Shadows, and it's going to be a tough episode to do. And I'm not going to ask you. So
I'll answer any. I mean, I was around while they were making it. So I even Neil Fredericks and I even went to their set.
So I'm jumping ahead here a little bit in my notes, but my question was when I remember Book of Shadows, I remember they treated the Blair Witch Project it was a work of fiction at that point. And when I'm watching Shadow of the Blair Witch, you still treat it very much these are things that happened and there's a real history here. How much of a fine line was it to kind of kind of thumb your nose a little bit at Artisan and say like, nope, this is the direction I'm going in for the piece I'm creating for it, and also like the direction that Berlinger decided to move in?
I mean, there's no nose thumbing going on there at all. Originally, I had pitched, and the reason I went to the Blair Witch 2 set was because I had fully written a different special for Shadow of the Blair Witch, and I feel like it can be said now, and I try to be very diplomatic about this stuff. And I just want to, before I even get into anything about Book of Shadows, I just want to say I think Joe Berlinger is a friggin' master filmmaker, and I admire his work, and I love his documentaries, and I loved his new Ted Bundy movie. Like, I have nothing against Joe Berlinger. I understand the circumstance he was in, and every filmmaker, when they're handed the opportunity that they want, which is make a feature film, and the circumstance is crappy, i.e., in his case, it's January. This needs to be in theaters this upcoming October, and it's a sequel to a movie you didn't like because he did not like the first Blair Witch. I think every filmmaker will say, sure thing. I mean, the feature film I directed, Alien Raiders, was a similar situation where it was like, I was offered it actually by Dan Myrick. 6 weeks after the day I said yes, we were on set shooting it. The script needed drastic rewrites, and the Writers Guild, we all knew, was about to go on strike. And I had a really excellent writer, Dan's wife, actually, Julia, who I've known for years. I had her for half of development, and then I had to kind of wing it on my own after that because the WJ went on strike. I'm only telling you the story to say, like, I get Joe Berlinger was offered a shit sandwich, and he was like, you know, if I eat this shit sandwich real good, then maybe next shit sandwich will have a little bit less shit in it. I don't know that that's what he said. I'm saying that is a common way that filmmakers would approach something like this. So anyway, I'm not disparaging it. But to answer your question about Shadow of the Blair Witch, I had written another special, and I was trying to give Book of Shadows its own mythology, and I think that my approach was a little naive. I was very new to the business side of the business, I'd only lived in LA for not even a year at that point. And Burkittsville 7, I could run wild with that because that's my own mythology and I'm not stepping on anyone's toes. But it never really occurred to me that I could really step on somebody's toes, because the mythology I tried to come up with for Book of Shadows, I wanted it to have its own mythology. And so I wanted to say it was, even as I say this now, I'm like, I totally get why there was pushback. I wanted to say it was like a cursed production, like The Exorcist or Poltergeist or whatever, or that there were like weird anomalies coming up in the negative, and like to create this whole crazy, I wanted it to have its own unique mythology that didn't fly to the heart of Blair Witchiness at all, because as a movie it moved away from that, and Artisan had approved that concept, and I actually went off and wrote a full script, and it got approved, and the reason Neil and I went to the Blair Witch 2 set was to start part of it was shooting interviews. We shot interviews with almost all the leads from Book of Shadows and Joe Berlinger. And so I'd given them kind of the bio like I did on Burkittsville 7, like I did on Video Palace, to memorize, and they all did their thing, and we shot interviews, including Nancy Schreiber, the DP. Like it was like we were off to the races. And then when Artisan saw their first cut of Book of Shadows, they hated it. And I remember I was at Birds, which is a cafe in like right below the Hollywood sign, with an executive from Artisan, and she handed me a copy of Paradise Lost and Paradise Lost 2 on VHS, and basically told me the basic concept of Shadow of the Blair Witch as they wanted me to make it now. And I said, what about the script I already wrote? And she's like, oh no, we're not going to do that. Like that was, I feel like today, for the most, like if something like that were to happen, there'd be a meeting. There'd be like a phone call where it's like, this thing that you've been working your ass off on, unfortunately, here's how the stars have aligned. But I think I was so new that they were like, yeah, we'll just make them do whatever we want. And that's fine. That's cool. I mean, she was never mean or rude. She wasn't a bad person.
But it was really clear that, like, nope, this is the direction you need to go in.
What they wanted was they wanted to pretend that the events of Blair Witch 2 were real and they were dramatizing them. And I said, so the idea is last year a movie came out and then some crazy guy murdered a bunch of people. And less than a year later, we're releasing an entertaining horror movie based on the real murders that happened between last year and this year. And they were like, yep. And so some of the things that I dug my heels in about was like, there's sections in there where we have family members in silhouette who are protesting, trying to stop the movie from getting released. And I'm like, that's what would happen. If somebody murdered my sister last year and this year an entertaining movie came out. It's not like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and the Manson killings happened 40, 50 years ago. It's like last year, like, her clothes still smell like her and you're making a movie about somebody murdering her. Like, that's not cool. And I think that there was a bit of cynicism in that, but I tried to steer into, okay, well, first of all, I studied the Joe Berlinger documentaries, and I'm like, it was him and Bruce Sinofsky. Everyone always forgets Bruce Sinofsky co-directed the first, like, 4 or 5 movies that Joe made. And Bruce passed away like 10 years ago, unfortunately. He was kind of young. But I'd met both of them at the Florida Film Festival years earlier when they had Brothers Keeper, and then they came back with the first Paradise Lost movie. And I got to chat with them a little bit back then. I doubt they remembered. I know Joe didn't remember it at that point because, to him, I think I was, one of the original makers of the film that he didn't like, and he didn't really need to hear me out. But he's always, I haven't run across him that many times. He's always remembered me. He's always been very pleasant. So, I'm not here to crap on him. And again, I think he's a masterful, amazing filmmaker. So, but yeah, so my Shadow of the Blair Witch, the one that got made, or the one that got finished, because we actually started shooting the other one, that one was me trying to wrap my head. And when we were making Video Palace, Manella would sometimes call me out for being like very literal about this stuff when I'm making something that is purporting to be a documentary. Like, I'm really trying to be very consistent and say, okay, every piece of media actually needs to come from somewhere. I can't just have a thing that conveniently shows up and doesn't make any sense why it's there. And I think that, I've seen a lot of found footage movies, and some do it better than others. And I wouldn't call Shadow of the Blair Witch a found footage movie. I would call it a fake documentary. Like, it's not supposed to be found footage. It's like, we shot interviews, we shot this, we shot that. And, it turned out to be a pretty good experience, but I was so exhausted from Burkittsville 7, and then we rolled literally right from Burkittsville 7 into that, like, no break.
Speaking on the Burkittsville 7, I mean, you got a chance with that one to really step outside the scope of the Blair Witch Project. What made you choose to focus? What made you choose to focus on the Rustin Parr story?
Well, so I was brought in to pitch ideas for that. And so, Curse of the Blair Witch had been a huge success on Sci-Fi, like a giant runaway hit for SciFi Channel, as it was known then, before it was Sci-Fi with Y's. And so when the Blair Witch Project was premiering on Showtime the following summer, Showtime wanted an original special. And at that point, all of the Haxon guys were working on Heart of Love. They'd all kind of moved on, except for Greg, who was working on some TV stuff for them. And so none of them really wanted to dip their toe into the Blair Witch world again. And I was literally on a phone call with, I want to say, at least Greg and Ed and, was it Amaret Jones or John Hageman, one of the execs over at Artisan, and it was all for the marketing department. And they were like, "Why don't you talk to Ben? He did Curse of the Blair Witch, and he directs. Like, I feel like it was a huge favor to me, and also for them. I think they kind of just didn't want to worry about it. So they had me come in, and what Showtime wanted and what Artisan wanted, and again, this is a marketing project. So when you see all the naked old man butts walking around in Burkittsville 7 in the insane asylum in the 1960s, just remember this is a commercial. But what they wanted was yet another documentary in the vein of Curse of the Blair Witch, but they didn't want to talk about the first movie at all, or as little as possible. Like, they didn't want to go into any more thing about Heather, Mike, and Josh, because Curse of the Blair Witch had kind of beaten that story to death anyway. And they didn't want to talk at all about Book of Shadows, which was like shooting at that time. So they were sort of like, what other story can we tell inside the Blair Witch universe? And to me, that was like, okay, well, it's a deep dive into some of the mythology. And so I went back to them, and you can only pull moves like this when you're hot. Because Blair Witch was like big money, and basically I had the I had the endorsement from all the original creators, and also I had been part of the original making of it and Curse of the Blair Witch, so I could walk in and pitch something this fucking weird. I got the Frederick Wiseman documentary Titicut Follies, which you couldn't buy at the time. You can get it directly from Frederick Wiseman now, like on DVD. But you couldn't buy it back then. So there was a place, or still is a place in LA called Eddie Brandt's Saturday Matinee. They wouldn't rent it to you. Yeah, it's a great place. Have you been there? Yeah, I love that place. So they wouldn't rent it to you, but Titicut Follies had played on PBS rather. So if you rented another movie, they would just let you take the VHS. And so I took that VHS and then copied it so I could show it to the artisan people. So Titicut Follies is a documentary that was made in a Massachusetts prison for the criminally insane. I want to say in 1962
Bridgewater
or 63.
State. It's right down the street from me.
So you know way more about it than I do. So it is the most unvarnished documentary. Frederick Wiseman, his signature move is basically kind of putting you in the place as opposed to having a series of interviews and trying to tell a story. It's more about kind of trying to create the feeling of what it's like to be there. And Titicut Follies was very controversial in its time. In fact, it was made in 1962 or 61. And it didn't air on PBS. It was made for PBS. It didn't air on PBS until like 1992 or 1991. So it took like 30 years. But it was beloved by documentary lovers because of its sheer ballsiness of just walking around this mental institution where these naked, old, creepy men were being herded around like cattle and kind of abused. And so I brought that into them and said, I want Kyle Brody to have ended up in a thing like this. And there happens to be a documentary filmmaker there who will sort of be our Frederick Wiseman. And then I showed them, I believe it was the Errol Morris documentary, Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. And I was basically like, I'm going to juxtapose these two styles. So we're going to have modern day interviews, reenactments, and then when we get to this, footage of old Kyle Brody, who is going to be this horrifying, scary, schizophrenic man being pushed around and treated weird and also naked. It's going to be like raw and blah, blah, blah. I don't know how I pitched it, how I got away with it, but they were like, okay. And the budget was more than I'd ever had for anything in my life. I think the budget was $350,000 to make that. So it's like more than 10 times what the Blair Witch Project cost. And, I wasn't in the Directors Guild or the Writers Guild. I do believe we were all SAG with the actors. We shot it pretty quickly, and we actually shot it in a former mental institution, Camarillo State. And while we were shooting there, on the other side of the campus, Pearl Harbor, Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, was using the same campus for something else. All I know is I saw a lot of big trucks. They're probably shooting some hospital stuff there, but you walked in there and it actually looked a lot like Titicut Follies. It was a terrifying place. I think now they've torn it down and turned it into a college or something. I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, but that was sort of the genesis of Burkittsville 7. And, to this day, one of my favorite things of my own that I've ever gotten to make, and also by far the strangest thing I've ever been able to successfully pitch to anybody. Like you don't go into a room and bring up it's not the most obscure documentary, but in Hollywood, bringing up anything that's like over 5 years old, you might as well be saying, well, D.W. Griffith, blah, blah, blah. Like they get lost very quickly. And to bring up a documentary that, like, you would see it if you were taking a documentary class in film school, but it's not like it makes the rounds out here. And at the time I was a little offended, but now I'm actually like, I really got through to those executives because they made Joe Berlinger pay homage to Titicut Follies in the opening scenes of Book of Shadows when the Jeff Donovan character is in the mental institution and they force feed him through the nose. Like, that's one of the big, terrifying, horrible scenes in Titicut Follies. And we sort of threw away an homage to that a little bit by having somebody being fed through the nose, but not grotesquely. And Joe Berlinger, like, did the Marilyn Manson music video version of the actual scene where the guy's got the cigarette with the ash hanging over the goop that he's pouring into the funnel that's going into his nose. And it was and I know that they did that because they told me they did that. We were working on Shadow of the Blair Witch, and this executive said, like, hey, like, we're doing reshoots and we got Joe Berlinger to do this Titicut Follies thing. And I'm like, at the time I was like, oh, fuck you. How dare you steal the thing I stole?
Well, I remember too, like, that's the minute, because I think the first 3 minutes and 20 seconds of Book of Shadows are pretty interesting. And then the use of the Marilyn Manson music kicks in, and it's kind of like the Hello Fellow Kids, Steve Buscemi meme come to life in film form for me for the rest of the movie is like where it loses me. But what I love about the Burkittsville 7 is this exploration of, like, really degenerative mental health. And one of the things that it's not addressed in there, and it's like really like this person, Cal Brody, he's either the character of Chris, who's like hammering this point home that he thinks that it's Kyle that is the one that murdered all these kids, is like he never factors in that maybe seeing 7 kids butchered in front of you by a crazy person might drive somebody to, like, what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. He's like, it's just this guy's pure evil.
Yeah, well, I was trying to create a character with a hardcore agenda, like, And at the time then, and maybe again less so now, I've always been like a fan of a good conspiracy theory without really subscribing to any of them, or certainly not in a long time. And I think conspiracy theories have gotten less entertaining because they make people go into pizza restaurants with guns now for whatever reason. But I always think it's interesting when someone's kind of smart, not as smart as they think they are, and they concoct some bullshit idea about how the world is organized and then won't let it go. I mean, actually, a really good modern-day version of that is the History Channel show Ancient Aliens, which I can't get enough of. I can't watch that show enough. I will watch every episode that they ever make of that show.
Yeah, and it's my wife. Yeah.
It's like they built a monument to fuzzy thinking, we're going to go and be academically stupid. We're going to trip over every logical fallacy we can on the way to our preordained conclusion, and that's the kind of character that Chris Carrasco is in Burkittsville 7. And like his Kyle Brody's sister's like, just get out of my life, you crazy person! Like, let my dead brother be dead and stop saying he was a murderer. And I went out of my way and I did a lot of research to try and make the Kyle Brody character obviously schizophrenic. So, like, you're not going to get anything out of him, really. But are schizophrenics murderers? Probably some of them. I don't know.
Yeah, and I deal with I've actually dealt with a fair number of schizophrenics in one of my jobs. And, like, for the most part, they're fairly harmless. Yeah. But it's just, that's obviously what we see there with Kyle Brody is just taking, obviously not getting any sort of proper treatment is going to drive a person to that. What I found so fascinating about Chris is, like, he has no connection to any of this. Like, if I remember correct, he's just this, like, balding middle-aged dude in Ohio that somehow has latched onto this thing. and he just won't leave it alone. And it's just, he makes all these weird connections. I mean, you could like almost see like the tinfoil hat like getting put on his head midway through the film. It's just a really fascinating character.
He's like a serial killer enthusiast, and there's tons of those people as well who, you know, like will sit around and, you know, like I didn't know about these people at the time, but like the people who like get together and go to all the actual murder locations where the Zodiac killer killed people. And they do that today. And it's like, there's better ways to make friends than to gather around the Zodiac killer. But I mean, like, I'm not disparaging anyone's weird ass hobby. I have my own weird ass hobbies, but there's a certain morbidity to it, and there's a certain amount of like, in the case of Chris Carrasco, there's like a certain amount of detachment from the reality. Like, okay, if we're saying all these people really died, then you're a sick fuck for getting excited about trying, like, you're not solving a crime. You're just trying to, you're just trading cards about the murders. Like, it's just not that, you know, it's a morbid fascination, but it's a real fascination. And, you know, I very intentionally kind of filled him with that.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. It's interjecting yourself where you're not really needed for some minor bit of notoriety. So I know we're working backwards here. You know, we haven't even spoken about Curse of the Blair Witch, but I was kind of wondering, when was it decided that like they were going to use this kind of like mini documentary as a piece of marketing? When did you get involved in saying, this is what we're going to create ahead of the movie coming out?
Well, again, this is probably a question for Mike Manello. When you talk to Ed, I bet Ed knows this too. But Mike was, you know, in the making of Curse of the Blair Witch, Mike was probably the single most involved person. So, I don't know when it was decided. Here's what I know. Cause at that point I moved to LA in January of 1999. And then literally it got bought at Sundance the day before I arrived in LA. Like we got to LA and it was in the papers that day that it had been sold at Sundance. And so they were all still in Orlando doing their Orlando thing and promoting the film and going to Cannes and being, you know, big time filmmakers, as well they should have. And I was in LA answering telephones at a corporate headhunting company, and that's actually where I met a guy named Chris Carrasco that I named that character after. And I named it after him because he was the one in that office who predicted Blair Witch was going to be a big hit. So I wasn't in Orlando when a lot of these decisions were made, but I think that what happened was, and again, Ed or Mike could tell you more clearly, they had those phase 2 assets like the Rustin Parr prison stuff and the Luke and Johnson kind of in search of looking stuff, mystical occurrences. They had a few of those things, and I think that they kind of went like, it wouldn't cost very much to make this. And they reached out to me because I think they were going to Cannes, and Ed and Dan didn't have the bandwidth to write it. And because I had written a lot of the mythology, they asked me if I would do it. And I was like, get paid and I get to stop answering phones at this freaking corporate headhunting company? You got it. So, you know, I went home and on, my then girlfriend, now wife's PC from college, wrote up, nobody ever taught me to do this, and I don't know that it's like a real technique that anyone besides me ever does in the way that I do it, but we wanted to create kind of background for the actors to audition and also to for the actual interviews to basically be interviewed. So they wanted basically a bio that was like 2 or 3 pages long, or I don't know if they wanted it or if I pitched that idea. I honestly don't remember the genesis of how this came about. I will say that, again, this is a technique I used on Video Palace. I used it on all the Blair Witch specials. I used it on the Hellboy special I did. It's a way to make a very credible sounding interview. With the right actor, of course. But anyway, so, I came up with the characters. I don't know how many of them they specifically wanted. Like, I know Mike's brother was one that they were like, this character is going to be in here. And I wrote all these bios that were then that I emailed off. 1999. So for all I know, maybe I faxed them, but I think I emailed them. And then I also wrote like all the VO and the, kind of structure. Like I know how this kind of a show, like a sightings kind of a show is structured. And I just kind of built it around like what I thought it would look like on paper at the time. And, sort of a best guess. And the beauty of doing the interviews the way that we did was it enabled Mike, who I also think, in addition to producing it, also did all the physical editing of it. He could cut the interviews so they looked like interviews when interviews are edited. Crazy enough, I don't think people put enough thought into that. But it's like, if I script out everything that I want you to say and you say it all exactly the way I want you to say it, even if I am a genius and I write dialogue that sounds just the way an interview would sound, it's not, when you cut it together, it's going to feel like a scripted thing that you cut together, as opposed to the act of cutting up an interview, the way that you Frankenbite an interview, which is what everyone calls it, that is going to end with something that, as an audience member, you're kind of unconsciously going to accept it as real because it feels cut up in a certain way, because it has to be. And so we created all that, and I built on the mythology. Like, the mythology front, if you find the original pitch tape that was on John Pearson's show Split Screen, that was the mythology walking into the movie, into making the first movie. And a lot of it had to be expanded upon for Curse. And I feel like that was where I got to do the stuff that I was talking about earlier, where it's like, I'm going to give, if 3 people talk about the same thing, I'm going to give them all subtly different stories to tell.
Mythology by way of the kids' game Telephone.
Correct. Exactly. And it's conscious. Like sometimes people on Facebook or whatever will ask, will kind of try and get me to say, well, what's canon? And I'm like, it's folklore. So there really isn't canon. It's not like the Star Wars universe where we know where Boba Fett came from or whatever. Like it's a little plastic. It moves around depending on who's telling it, because you have to go, okay, well, even if we go, Burkittsville is a teeny tiny place, but the stories of the Blair Witch aren't all centered there. And there isn't, like, even though there's a book called The Blair Witch Cult that kind of figures into this, there's one existing copy of it. Nobody's read it. Like, and whoever wrote that was like one of those old West writers, like that dude in Unforgiven, who's like a sensationalist. I mean, frankly, that's what happened with the Bell Witch. A lot of the story of the Bell Witch as we know it today was kind of codified by somebody who wrote a book about it in the 1800s. But they're writing a big, sensational, weird book because they want to sell books, and they're making everything up. And that's how these stories kind of get promulgated through culture. And so I wanted to feel like the residue of a story that has been telephone gamed around a lot.
Well, that's also what is so brilliant about not just the Blair Witch Project, but the fact that, I mean, it came out in 1999 and it wasn't just a film. I mean, the mythology was so huge that, I mean, like you said, it's not just particularly the Blair Witch. I mean, we had the movie, we had your mini docs, the books, the video games. I mean, Josh's Mix on CD. Like, I can't think of a single film that gave its viewers and fans such a massive amount of information. I mean, this is like the MCU years before that stuff, like this is, I think that's part of the effect and the lasting impact of the Blair Witch Project, is that you guys all together gave us as audience members and fans like so much to latch onto.
Well, and I think that to a certain degree, some of that's making up for the fact that you don't see a witch in the movie. We got to give you something. No, but I think that it's something that none of us went to school to learn how to do this or whatever, but I think we all naturally were attracted to the idea of kind of building a universe around an idea. And like I said earlier, Mike Manello basically has been, very quietly, but very successfully doing ad campaigns that are sort of masquerading as I wouldn't say masquerading. They're ad campaigns that are deeper mythology. Like, for instance, he did a campaign for the Man in the High Castle that was called Resistance Radio, and it came out like 2 or 3 years ago. And so it was set at the same time as the Man in the High Castle, and they had DJs kind of doing kind of sending out a pirate signal that was supposed to be from that world, and then they brought in current musicians and had them record songs that sounded like they were from the 60s. And it was a brilliant idea. And it got in the newspapers, and it did a lot of stuff like that. He did a thing for the Purge TV series at Comic-Con a few years ago where they set up like a party city, but it was Purge City. And it was like you could go to a Party City-like place and get Purge items. Mike's brain goes in that direction almost automatically, which, again, not to keep bringing up Video Palace, but it was one of the things that he and I loved about doing Video Palace was that we got to kind of go in and make up a new mythology for a brand new thing that, again, we could sort of tailor it however we wanted to at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. I had one more question right now on Curse of the Blair Witch. If I remember correctly, you actually use a lot of the actual family members of like Josh, Mike, and Heather to take part in the documentary.
Only to my recollection, it was Mike's brother.
Okay.
I don't think any of the other people were like. It was Josh's girlfriend and Heather's parents.
It's like grandfather, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely not Heather's real grandfather, and it was Mike's real brother.
Oh, how weird was it for Mike's brother to talk about his brother like he was dead?
I was not there when they shot any of it, so I couldn't tell you. I can answer all of your Burkittsville questions because I was there for that whole shoot, obviously, because I directed it. But when they made Curse of the Blair Witch, I was literally in LA. I think as soon as I turned in my script, I went back to work answering phones at that corporate because, got to feed the monkey.
Right. So what was the first time with Curse of the Blair Witch that you had something here that really added to the overall story, for fans going into the Blair Witch blind, aside from like what they had seen online and what they had seen on from the Sci-Fi Network? Like, what was your first time like, whoa, I think we created something really cool here?
I mean, when I saw the cut of it, I just bought it. Like, I feel like, because I didn't direct Curse. Ed and Dan directed it. But when I was seeing footage of it anyway, because like while they were editing it, I would have to write stuff to kind of bridge two things together or whatever. And I even happened to be in Orlando, and so some of the footage that was supposed to be the excavation of the house, it was not footage. It was like a bunch of stills. I think I either took some of those stills, or it was like 3 or 4 of us went to a place and set that up and art directed it and took a bunch of stills on like a disposable camera that we bought at CVS or whatever. So I was seeing bits and, dribs and drabs of it. And I feel like as soon as I saw the performances, I was like, okay, I buy this. I buy it all the way. Like, I have no problem believing that these are all real people and that what they're talking about is real. And I think in a weird way, a few years later, Greg brought me back to Orlando to work on an ill-fated reboot of In Search Of that he was an executive producer on. And Alan Landsberg, the original creator of In Search Of, was part of this project. So I got to meet and see him. But it was sort of like an education in like, oh, that's how you tell a load of bullshit and get people to believe it. Like, I mean, it takes a discipline and a point of view, and it takes a good deal of thought, but it's actually not that hard, if that makes sense. Like, what is that kind of documentary? I mean, if you talk about a show like Ancient Aliens today, obviously, Ancient Aliens is not a cheap show because there's lots of outrageously expensive visual effects. But if you take that out of the equation, that's a reenactment. That's a style of reenactment that Ancient Aliens does. So it's interviews, which are not a big deal to do, right? It's a crew of like probably no more than 5 people conducting an interview. You can do it with 2. I've certainly done it. I've done real documentaries, where it was like me and a sound person, or me, a camera person, and a sound person. So you're going to build it mostly on that. And then artifacts, which is just like scanned photographs or flat art of some kind. So in the case of this, it's like, oh, we have to make it look like a bunch of college students excavating under a house. Well, we're about that age right now, so let's go find something that looks like a house and set up how we think it would look excavated and take some pictures, and it'll look as good as anything else. I mean, you can get very involved with that stuff, but a lot of times the real artifacts were done in a slapdash kind of manner, because they weren't being made as artifacts for a documentary, right? If you're looking at, a Freedom of Information Act release or something like that, it's like, it's a document with a bunch of stuff redacted. Are people going to go crazy and freeze frame it and zoom in? Yeah, they might, but, also you don't have to show them enough to give them enough to work off of. Old woodcuts or whatever. There was a guy who was, part of our crew, named Christian Guevara, who created some of the, the older looking artwork. But like that's all easy to create. You kind of just have to say like, okay, these are the building blocks we're going to make this, this lie out of this. It's an entertainment. It's not a hoax. We're not trying to convince anyone that a fake thing is a real thing. But if we were trying to convince them, how would we go about doing it? It's, and you kind of try and get as close to reality as possible. And I think that audiences like to play that game. They like to, the less you ask them to suspend their disbelief, the more they're willing to go along with something. I mean, obviously, if you're watching The Fast and the Furious, you've suspended your disbelief because Vin Diesel and The Rock aren't really chasing each other in cars. But if you're watching something like that, or again, to go to Video Palace, it's like I don't think anyone listening to Video Palace believed it was real. But we tried to make it sound like a real podcast, like a serial kind of podcast where somebody's, we broke it apart the same way we did with Curse of the Blair Witch and said, what are the pieces of that kind of storytelling, and how do you go about creating them? How would you go about inventing them as opposed to discovering them?
So you have all these little pieces, and I think you laid them out pretty well right there, that a lot of people could do at that point. Like almost anyone could do those individual pieces and shape something together in some fashion that's entertaining at the very least. Where do you think the last bit of magic comes from that allows your audience to take that for at least an hour? I'm going to suspend my disbelief at this point and pretend it's real or get sucked in by it. Like, what's that bit of magic that you think that lets people take that leap with a creator at that point?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think that like the techniques themselves, I feel like I would be happy to share them with anyone because they're not sorcery anyway, and I've described it many times. I think that firstly, creating a compelling mystery is the hard part. That's the essence of the writing of it. Like, how do we create the compelling mystery? And the compelling mystery at the center of Blair Witch, which existed before I got involved, was these three filmmakers went off to make a documentary about this anomaly, this piece of folklore, and then they disappeared, and then their footage turned up. Like, that is a delicious mystery, because you assume that in the footage there might be the solution to what happened to these people. And when Greg Hale pitched me that idea in his living room and didn't tell me that it was fake, I believed it. I think that it's just believable enough. Like, I can believe that people could disappear while making a documentary. I believe their footage could turn up. If that documentary was about an old, piece of scary folklore, then that footage might be scary too. I don't know. Like, none of that sounds like insane to me. Or improbable, but then how you explore that and how you build around that nut of an idea, that's I mean, that's just understanding, I think, the structure and the form of how those kinds of stories are told. And I also think that part of it that filmmakers don't like to do is taking your hands off the wheel of controlling every second of everything that's going to be in there. So if you were to take my advice, for instance, and say, I'm going to make a fake documentary and I'm going to write out these bios, and then the actors are going to come in and I'm going to interview them, and I'm going to construct the interviews out. And again, you can always say, when you're doing those interviews, you can say, well, actually, he would, like, this is more important. Make sure that you hit this point. Do it all the time. But they're putting it in their own words, so it sounds like them, not like you as a writer. And I think that a lot of people want to have the authorial voice of writing all the dialogues. A friend of mine gave me a script to read recently for what I thought was a pretty cool idea for a found footage movie, but all the dialogue was very written and snappy. Like, this person spent a lot of time really drilling down and writing some snappy ass dialogue. And one of my biggest reactions was like, throw all your snappy dialogue away. It gives it away that this is not found footage. It doesn't feel natural because that's not how people talk in their day-to-day lives. I mean, this is why Aaron Sorkin doesn't write found footage horror movies. And it's not to say Aaron Sorkin isn't a great writer. He's one of our best writers, but he writes in a stylized way, and we kind of accept screenwriting. Screenwriting is a stylized writing medium, and what Blair Witch was attempting to be, and what I think the best found footage movies do, is they try and work against it. What Ed and Dan and Greg kind of came up with for Blair Witch, which no one else really does, but to me is the essence of what made it work, is that it is a real documentary, in that these three actors did not know what they were about to find every day. They didn't know what they were walking into. And so you're seeing their real natural reactions to things, and they know it's a horror movie, so they're supposed to be getting creeped out more by it. And when we're fucking with them in the middle of the night, which we really were, like, we'd sneak out to their campsite and fuck with them in the middle of the night all the time. Every night there was a whole plan, and Ed and Dan and Greg and sometimes me had architected whatever the nature of that plan was. When we went to do that, they were filming what they were seeing. Now, they knew that they should try to avoid seeing us, but if they'd caught us on camera, obviously they just would have cut around it. But it is a real documentary. So Ed and Dan had written a very complex scriptment that was like 40 pages long. And if you were to read the scriptment and watch the movie, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's pretty close. It's reasonably close. But they didn't go in there and script any lines of dialogue. That dialogue is all Heather, Mike, and Josh improvising. And it's such a pure form of scene work. But I think a lot of filmmakers don't want to trust it, because it means you're going to have to burn a lot more, not film anymore, but you're going to have to burn a lot more footage to get to the good stuff. And it's going to be a pain in the ass to edit it, of course. But, and you're not going to be able to say like, oh, that great line of dialogue that I wrote, blah, 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 because you didn't write it.
I think that's where a lot of found footage films go wrong, is that you can tell 100% of it is just acting, whereas films like the Blair Witch Project, it feels very natural. Or more recently, the WNUF Halloween special. Both, I don't know if you guys have seen that, but I mean, it's basically this rumored long lost Halloween special that was on a news report, and it comes with like fake commercials that just feel real. It feels like somebody dubbed the tape over and over again. Like the Blair Witch Project and the WNUF Halloween special, I think, are two examples of it just done completely right, to where you get so lost in what you're watching that for a little bit you forget that you're watching a fictional film. And I that's where found footage, I think, goes wrong so much. Is like, I appreciate films like Cloverfield and that kind of stuff, but there isn't a single moment in that film that I get lost in it and like, oh my God, you know what I mean? Like what you guys created with the Blair Witch Project, I mean, it's so easy to kind of like experience it and kind of live vicariously through this journey.
But I think that is the hardest part, I think, as a creator, is taking your hands off the wheel and saying like, okay, like I'm creating. It's no less directing to do what Ed and Dan did versus, being James Cameron and having absolute control over every element. What Ed and Dan did was they created an environment and they created an experiment in which a certain drama would unfold. And the drama that they designed unfolded the way they designed it to unfold, more or less. And, there are wrinkles and there are nuances that you couldn't have written that came out organically from the actors and from the locations that they found. And so you end up with a level of verisimilitude that's really hard to achieve, in my opinion, when you're doing a fiction film. Now, I direct theater and I direct, regular old fiction stuff, and I love doing it, and it's kind of what I aspire to do when I grow up, whenever the fuck that is. But I also see the value greatly in knowing how to make something feel that real. And to me, there's no better example than the American movie Quarantine, which was a remake of I want to say it was an Argentinian movie. It was Rec, correct. I think it was from Argentina, but I could be wrong. I know it's from South America. And Rec it's the same exact story. It's not shot for shot the same, but it's very similar. Rec feels out of control. Rec feels like you're just there with this news crew while this crazy shit is happening. And Quarantine feels... I love Quarantine. I saw it in the theater. I think it's actually a really good film, but it feels production designed. It feels lit. It feels contained and controlled like a regular movie. And it's not to slag it. I think it's good work, but it's harder for me to just go in and fully accept it. There are movies like I liked The Last Exorcism a bit, but there are two things that pulled me out of it. One of them was their use of sound, specifically music, but also like having characters walk across the street, but we can still hear them because it's like, no dingus, the microphone's with the camera. So why is the audio following them except for the filmmakers who wanted to have that ability? And I also thought that the ending felt very convenient. It felt like a scripted, satisfying ending. And I think that, like Paranormal Activity, in my opinion, works better as a found footage movie because it doesn't feel like it's dotting all its I's and crossing all its T's.
So I'm going to excuse the music in The Last Exorcism with this theory that only exists in my head because it's one of my favorite movies, period. I love that movie. I think Patrick Fabian should have the career that Patrick Wilson has. Dude's a charisma machine. I see that movie as a recruitment video for the cult behind everything. Like they show that afterwards as like, here's how we lure people in to come join our crazy satanic death cult. Hence it's more seen like a Lake Mungo type of movie where it's like an actual finished documentary with stuff put into it. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I have nothing to actually back that up. So it's
totally fair. I mean, I really like that movie. I'm not like slagging it. It's just it's my taste that it's like, if I'm supposed to believe this is found footage, then there would be no music on it. Then I should not really feel editing should be done for content and not for things like pacing. Like it's not, you should, and I mean, the thing is, as a filmmaker, it takes away so many of your toys because like when I'm making a regular narrative style film, I want to use music. I want to use great cinematography. I want to use, beautiful production design, and I want to be able to control and tell the story the way I want to tell it. But when I want to make something feel out of control, then I feel like I have to give up those toys. Like one of the ones that, and again, like I couldn't be a bigger fan of George Romero, but he made one found footage movie, and it was called Diary of the Dead. And I felt like, in a lot of instances, he wanted the things that a filmmaker gets when they're making a movie, not the things that accidentally show up when I'm here with a camera and everything is going to shit. And, like he wanted cross-cutting coverage. So he gave two people two cameras. But, the framing feels it feels like regular movie framing. It doesn't feel like I'm running from zombies and I sort of pointed the camera roughly back to where I thought it should be. And my hat's off to Romero for even doing the experiment. And again, like, I could not be a bigger fan of George Romero's. But that's an example of, in my opinion, when found footage doesn't stick to the discipline that it sets out to have.
Well, that to me is still why the Blair Witch Project works. And not to keep blowing smoke up everybody's ass, but why it works so much is because of the way it is filmed. It's not only that you don't see anything, it's that you can't see anything. You're completely helpless. And you're completely bound by the point of the view of, like, Heather and Josh, who are mostly holding the camera. And you're like, I'm along for this ride at this point. I'm going to just have to go where you're taking me. And it really helps you buy in. It's getting a little bit late. I know I have to be up in about 6 hours, so I did want to end. No. This has been great. Trust me. This is what we look. This is why we do it.
Yeah, most definitely.
So I wanted to end by talking a little bit about the Video Palace, because I love that podcast, and I think that
thank you.
What shows like that and the first season of the Black Tapes, what it is allowing creators to do is, like, very similar to what I think Blair Witch Project and other films like it did, where you can, like, suspend that disbelief a little bit, especially I think in the video. How did you come about with this idea for this, like, collection of lost VHS tapes and this intertwining mystery?
Part of the VHS tape thing, lore, actually, that predates my involvement. That was Mike Manello and Nick Bracchia had come up with the idea and pitched it to Shudder. And part of it was that Shudder had a TV show called The Core that was a like a talk show kind of thing.
Right?
Sorry, what?
That was Mickey Keating, right?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think Mickey hosted that. Mm-hmm.
At the end, Sam Zimmerman would come out and give him a videotape to watch, and they were all white tapes. They were all white VHS tapes. And, Sam Zimmerman is the main curator over at Shudder. And so they were kind of building on the idea that those tapes were real. All of us share a fascination with something that Mike and Nick kind of coined as media horror. And media horror would be things like The Ring or Videodrome. And their ideas about, like, consuming certain media makes you consume more of it, and it becomes kind of an obsession, and it changes you somehow. It's a little bit akin, I'd say, to body horror in a way, but it's less about, like, destroying. It's more about kind of the mental breakdown. So when Mike and Nick kind of first showed me that was one of the ideas that was kind of already baked into the cake, was this idea of these white tapes that were kind of not exactly cursed, but were kind of legendary. And as someone who grew up on VHS, like, I immediately got it. There are these kind of lurid, weird VHS tapes that always intrigued me when I'd see them at video stores or whatever, but I was always afraid to watch them. Things like, Adam Green brings it up in the interview that we do with him, but, stuff like Faces of Death. That's a primo example of that kind of thing. But we love the idea that it would kind of be that it was more than just a videotape, that it was, sort of an invitation or a portal. Somehow it kind of opened up something in your brain that kind of led you into possibly other dimension kind of place. I have literally no news to break, but, like, in the event that we're ever able to do a second season, like the mythology for Video Palace is, like, so barely touched upon in the first season. There's so much more to go into that I hope we get to do a second season, because I feel like there's a lot to explore that we haven't even gotten to yet. Yeah. It would literally take Shudder to order it, because we all want to do it very badly. Yeah. Yeah. We can't. Yeah. Shudder owns the whole property, so we can't really do anything without them. I hope we get an opportunity to do it. In the meantime, Bob DeRosa and I, who co-wrote it together, we are developing another horror idea at Audible, which I probably can't say more than that at the moment because it hasn't been greenlit. But they had us write a pilot script in a series Bible, and then we are going to the next level past that, which is they're ordering a script. But it's not at all like Video Palace, though. I love Video Palace, and for years before we did that, Mike Manello and I had been talking about just ourselves for fun making a horror podcast that would be very much in the style that we made Video Palace in. That would be sort of like a first person real podcast. Like the thing you're listening to is the thing. It's Serial or In the Dark or any other number of podcasts where you're listening to the person who's presenting it to you. And they're kind of talking in your ear, because there's something about the podcast format that I find irresistible. I subscribe to over 100 podcasts. I'm obsessed with podcasts, and I've been way into them since whenever they first showed up in iTunes. It was like 2006 or 2008 or whatever. It was one of the things I gravitated towards. And I feel like podcasts are a little bit like novels, and in that it's very intimate. Like we don't sit around and read a novel to each other. We read it by ourselves. And the same way, like we listen to podcasts when we're, in the car by ourselves, or we're at the gym, or, for me, like a lot of times it was when I was walking the dog, and, I'm by myself, and it's actually a perfect place to get super creeped out. A lot of the podcasts that I listen to and love are, true crime kind of stuff anyway. A lot of them are serial killer podcasts, which maybe makes me a little bit more like Chris Carrasco than I wish I was. But, but I do listen to a lot of those things. And I remember I was listening to a serial killer podcast called Happy Face. That is an amazing podcast. If you haven't heard it, can't recommend it highly enough. But there was one scene in it where they're describing one of the murders, and I was at Target, like picking up a toy for my son, and I like physically felt ill when this one murder was described to me. And if I'd seen it in a movie, I don't think it would have affected me the same way, because I'm building it in my head. Sort of like what you were saying about Blair Witch, and we had, even at Shudder, we had conversations about possibly turning some aspect of Video Palace into a TV series or a movie or this or that, and there was always a sense of like, how do we show something like the Eyeless Man without it just looking like a dude in a monster suit? Like, it can't be that. It's got to, like, we've created somebody who's not really entirely seated in our dimension. So how do you show that? And there's a way, but it's all very it's a lot of fun to play in the audio realm, because you really can, by depriving people of every sense except for audio, you're making them fill in a lot of, they're filling in a lot of stuff. And that doesn't mean that you get to be lazy. I think it's the same kind of work. I mean, like the script for Video Palace is, for the whole season is 183 pages long, and we're able to record it very quickly. But that was because, unlike a movie, you don't have to worry about cameras and lenses and makeup and hair and props and costumes and lights and, sets. So you can move very, very quickly. But the scene work that we did is the same scene work you would do for a movie or a TV show or a play, frankly.
Well, it's a much more democratic platform as well. It's pretty much anybody with a microphone and a computer. I mean, Jerry and I are just two jamokes that are like recording these episodes here, and it just allows us to have a little platform where anybody can find us fairly quickly if they want to. And to your point, like,
but if you're going to do oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you first.
Well, if you're going to do a fiction podcast,
whether it was like what we did, or whether it was, like an old school radio play style, or anything in between, it really wouldn't cost that much. Like, we recorded in a professional recording studio, but we had actually toyed with the idea of like, what if we just rent an office that's kind of quiet, and we say like, oh, okay, well, all the bedroom scenes are going to be in this room, and all of these scenes are going to be in this room, and when we record in a car, we're just going to go downstairs and get in a car and physically do it. And it would have slowed us down. We wouldn't have been able to make it as quickly because we recorded everything in about 5 days. But you don't need to have professional level stuff. I mean, I have a separate podcast where I interview cinematographers called Imaginatively, the Cinematography Podcast. And the microphone I'm recording myself on right now is the same one that Russell Carpenter spoke into, the DP from Titanic. And it's not an expensive microphone, and you can get these things in sound effects libraries. And as you know, Audacity or Audition or GarageBand or any of those softwares that you can do that. I mean, like, yeah, you can go so far as to learn Pro Tools and add all the bells and whistles. Or, you could do something that's not as expensive, but figure out a way to get there. And you could probably make a pretty fucking amazing fiction podcast. However you want it, again, whatever format you chose, you could do it. And it wouldn't cost very much. Like the things that cost us a lot of money were things like, dealing with the Screen Actors Guild and spending a lot of money on the recording studio. And like, because somebody else was handling post-production and not me, like, they had a staff. But given all that, the budget on Video Palace was very low, like much, much lower than making the lowest budget movie ever,
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And like you said, it's something where turning out the lights, lying in the dark, throwing on an episode at a time and taking that 30-minute deep dive into it, like, it gives you so much to just creep yourself out. And I think that's why we love horror movies. Like, at the end of the day, like, I'm a 44-year-old dude with a wife and a kid. Like, not being able to pay my mortgage is much scarier than something I'm going to see on a movie screen. Like, that's my escape. Yeah. But when you're lying in the dark and those lights are out and those headphones are in, then you get to let your imagination wander a little bit. And I don't think there's anything better than that.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, that's why I've been attracted to this form. And to a degree, like, Mike and I were excited, and Bob and Nick and all of it, Liam Finn, who produced it. I think we were all interested to see, could we pull it off? Because none of us that wasn't on our resume. Like, I didn't go to audio school. I went to film school, and and the way we recorded stuff, like the way I worked with the actors is the same way I would it's the same way I would work in a film environment or a theater environment. So like, I kind of insisted, like one of the people that we were working with had suggested we bring everybody in and put them in isolation booths so they can slide their dialogue around. And that's how you would do like an animated, an animated feature or whatever. You bring in Gilbert Gottfried. He goes through all his lines, he ad libs a bunch, and then you pat him on the ass and send him on his way. And the way that I kind of insisted we do it was anyone who's in a scene is in the same room with each other unless they're supposed to be over the phone. Like Sam Zimmerman, it was not physically in the room with us, but also you're hearing him on a phone line. Same with Steve Barton. But like Adam Green was in the same room, but all the actors doing scene work together were in the same room. And if they're walking in place because it was a small room. If Mark and Tamara are lying in bed having a conversation, we put Fernie pads on the floor and they laid down and talked and did their scene laying down. When Shane Mueller's chasing Mark Cambria to his car, they're really running all the way across the room. And it was a very pure kind of a scene work thing, but it's like, it doesn't cost anything to do it. I mean, they're not handling, like, we didn't have to bring in props or anything. We didn't make it complicated. We, in a way, made it easier for ourselves because, like, we know we're going to be going in and adding sound effects and ambience in later. The performances have to support that. So, if Chase is supposed to be, Chase Williamson, who plays Mark Cambria, if he's supposed to be lifting a heavy thing, give him a heavy thing to make him lift it. Like, how hard is that? It's not expensive. It's not time consuming. Just like go out of your way to create as much of the world as you would need to create those vocal performances. And then, then the sound effects person, which was a guy named Jeremy Lee at Diablo Sound, he had a lot to work with. But yeah, I mean, it's all, theater of the mind kind of stuff. Like how do you create that real space? How do you create the real, and in an alternate universe, or maybe on another project, I might do the plan of let's just rent an office and not even mess with having a professional sound house. Like if we weren't in such a hurry to crank it out because we really didn't have any time, it might make more sense to be like, yeah, let's record all the car scenes in a real car. I mean, we don't have to be driving, but we can sit in a car. It'll sound like we're recording it in a car if we record it in a car, as opposed to asking somebody later to EQ it so it sounds like it's in a car and put reverb and stuff like it's in a car. Well, and I listen to a lot of fiction podcasts, and I feel like a lot of them don't get that. I don't want to name names because I don't want to trash anybody, but there's one fiction podcast in particular that got a lot of play, that a lot of people loved, and I found it frustrating because it was obvious to me that they did the thing that we wouldn't do. They brought the actors in and just had them go through all their lines and then leave. So they don't feel like they're in the room with each other. They're not reacting to each other in real time. Whereas one that I will name is Homecoming, which Gimlet made, and it got made into a TV show with Julie Roberts. But the podcast, which starred Catherine Keener and Oscar Isaac, like I wouldn't bet the farm that I'm right about this, but I'm pretty sure that all the actors who are in a scene together are really in the room acting off of one another. It feels intimate and real, and like you're in the room with real people having a conversation. It doesn't feel presentational at all. And to me, that's kind of the high watermark of that kind of craft. And it doesn't cost more to do it. I just think that, like every art form, podcasting is evolving into different things. If you look back on like what made YouTube in 2005 when it was launched, and and then 5 years later, and then 5 years after that, like it's become more sophisticated and become more of its own thing, and less like America's Funniest Home Videos, or amateurs attempting to make television series. Like now it's just kind of its own thing. Like who would have ever thought of vlogging would be a thing, or unboxing videos. Like that would never happen on television. That would never happen in movies. But on this format, it's the most, it's the most exciting thing for whoever it is that loves that. Not me, but somebody.
Videos of this woman who repairs squishy toys. Like she cannot get enough of those. And I'm like, I look at those and I'm like, this is so ridiculous. And then I realize this woman is probably making more this month than I'm going to make all year. And then I get very sad. I get very, very sad.
Don't be sad. But realize that sort of the economics of it are a separate thing. But think of the phenomenology that brings about, garbage truck videos, which a friend of mine with a kid who's a little bit older than my son was like, yeah, get ready for the garbage truck videos. And I went on YouTube, and there are millions of views on like some dude holding his smartphone and filming a garbage truck driving down the street. I'm like, how, why? But like that stuff is a real contender for eyeballs, and people really want it. But I think that podcasts do the same thing, though. Like when I first started listening to podcasts, I was listening to a lot of stuff from Slate, and it was their executive producer Andy Bowers literally just reading Slate articles. And I was like, it's like reading an article, except I didn't have to read. What do you know? I'm walking a dog and I'm reading an article, getting smart. And then slowly it became a different thing where, it became more like a radio talk show kind of a thing. And then, of course, Serial blew it up. There are strengths and aspects that are so specific to podcasting that you just don't find in any other form. And it's partly because it's just audio, but it's not just because it's just audio, or, the Orson Welles War of the Worlds. We'd be doing only the high-tech version of that. Or we'd be doing only the high-tech version of, not even high-tech, we'd just be doing a slightly different version of, Terry Gross on NPR interviewing people. But like, what is it that we're doing? Like a show like yours, there are a lot of those. I listen to a bunch of them. There are things like, I would say that Adam Green and Joe Lynch's show, The Movie Crypt, is not unlike yours. It's a similar kind of a format, but also, basically any topic that you're excited about. I'm into science and skepticism, and there's, a whole universe of great skeptical podcasts like The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. And those people have gotten big enough that they got their own book deal, that like at least one of them quit his day job and full-time just makes that show. And, it's heartening to me to kind of see that. Or, a show like Lore, which it's one of those things where you're like, God damn it, I wish I would have thought of that, but I didn't, and that guy does it perfectly.
My favorite podcast right now, there's a show called The Lapsed Fan, and they do like 7-hour deep dives into old wrestling pay-per-views or the history of pro wrestling, and they're pulling in like crazy amounts of money on Patreon every month at this point, because they'll spend like 20 episodes talking about like world-class championship wrestling in the Von Erichs for like 4 months. And you have this basically Bible at that point, and it's incredible. And who would think there'd be a market for that? But here we are.
Yeah. One of my podcast laments of the last year was there was one that my friend Scott Weinberg was doing with Drew McWaney, called "The '80s All Over," and you can listen to.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Nothing on earth bummed me out more than finding out that they weren't going to finish it, because like I would be like, what's some rando fucking movie from 1983 that I've forgotten about? And I would look it up and I'd be like, oh, I wonder if they covered it. And then of course they had. It's like I would have to look at what month it came out, and then they would go into a deep dive on it. And I mean, like, to me, that was such a great idea. My wife and I had the idea, and maybe one day we'll do it or not. But it was similar to that. It was before 80s All Over was even on. But we had the idea of like going through and watching every movie that ever won the Oscar. Like go start at the very, very beginning and watch every Academy Award winner, and kind of do it, because even if you go back 10 years, they start to feel very retrograde, like, oh, sorry, I just dropped my phone and it made a big loud clunk. Sorry about that.
What bummed me out, because that was what I would call like a pad and paper podcast, where you would, when you're listening to it, have a little notepad next to you and jot down these movie titles. They would talk about it, like, I'm going to go back and find these. And it is sad. They just didn't have enough funding to kind of, because that was just such a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's a humongous undertaking. But I mean, like, but there's so many podcasts. Like one that I always go back to is Glenn Washington, the guy who does Snap Judgment, did a podcast called Heaven's Gate about the Heaven's Gate suicide cult. And when I first heard about it, I was like, I find that stuff really interesting. But Glenn Washington, if you've ever listened to Snap Judgment, you realize like he's just a very deep, thoughtful. I don't know him, but he seems like a very empathetic person. And when I heard that he'd done Heaven's Gate, I was like, why? Because Heaven's Gate is like this ridiculous thing where these people cut off their testicles and ate phenobarbital laced ice cream and murdered themselves so they could get on the comet Hale-Bopp. And it's like, it's all just an idiotic story. I mean, like a very entertaining, sensationalistic one. And then I listened to it, and Glenn Washington, by the time it was over, it's like you understand where these people were coming from. And it created like a weird sense of empathy for these people. And my whole point of view on them shifted from one of, I would say, scorn and mawkishness to one of like, I feel terrible for you that you felt like this is how you could fulfill yourself. But those people that felt very fulfilled by what they did, like, who am I to say that? I can say that I don't believe there was a UFO behind the comet Hale-Bopp that they all got on after they committed suicide. But who am I to say that they weren't living out their dream by doing this thing that sounds, ripshit bonkers to me?
Or what it takes to get to a place in your life in order to get to where you think that's like a really good choice. Well, Jerry, do you have anything you want to add before we sign out for the night?
No, I think we covered it all. It's been, I think, amazing. I'm really stoked on this one.
I am too. This is an episode in and of itself. This is no bonus. Ben, thank you so much for being generous with your time tonight. This has been an absolute blast. I'm not just talking about, just the supplemental material and the making of the Blair Witch, but I just think
just in general,
conversation we're having just about this is fascinating in and of itself. Where can our listeners find you online? We don't want to send people to your door, but where can people find you?
They can find me in Starbucks in Sherman Oaks, California, and I'm lonely, and they should say hello. My website is benrockonline.com. I've never been able to get benrock.com because it was owned by a boating company when the internet started. So Benrock Online, and when you go there, you'll be able to find my Twitter and all that other stuff. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter at Neptune Salad. I'm on fucking LinkedIn, for God's sakes. I don't know why, but I would just start with Benrock Online. You can see my reel, see the stuff I'm working on, and certainly find my social medias there.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, thank you so much, and congrats on the birth of your son, and enjoy these, enjoy it's going to be a wild ride when you get to the terrible twos.
I feel like I'm already there. Yeah. He's 16 months old, but I feel like he's 2 already.
Yeah. Oh, just wait until he's 17. My daughter turns 18 in March. That's been a ride.
Oh, dear Lord.
Right.
No, when I was a substitute teacher, it was all high school, so I've always been like, oh, kids are great. I don't know about teenagers.
Was addicted to trouble. Was addicted to pain.
So thank you once again to our very special guest, Ben Rock, for joining us. That was an absolute blast having him on earlier this week. Jerry and I were both really thrilled to get to talk to him. And dear listeners, thanks for putting up. I had a bit of a head cold that day when recording. We recorded pretty late. I think I tapped out a little bit after midnight. So I maybe didn't sound quite as up as normal because I was just stuffed to the gills with cold medicine. So here's what we have going on between now and then. Later this week, Jerry and I are going to be speaking with Eduardo Sanchez, the co-director of the Blair Witch Project, talking about his own personal history of bringing his vision, from concept to screen and the aftermath that followed. Really excited to talk to Eduardo. We're going to be doing our Book of Shadows episode as well, and then finishing our coverage of the Blair Witch series with 2016's The Blair Witch, the film written by Simon Barrett and directed by Adam Wingard. It was actually, to date, their last collaboration together after working on films like A Horrible Way to Die, You're Next, and of course The Guest. So hopefully we'll see more from them in the future. I think they work incredibly well together. Thank you for listening. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode. A little bit different from a normal episode for us, but like I said, we really love this series, and we're only doing more. We like the music in the background from my good friend Yoni Gordon off his upcoming album. Nice and cool. I think it fits what we do pretty well. You can find us over on Twitter at Pod and Pendulum. Go ahead and leave us some comments. We appreciate all the feedback you guys have given us. Ask us your questions on the Blair Witch Project, and we will do our best to answer them on the show. You can follow us individually over on Twitter at JerryIsJustOK, and I am at Mike_Snoonian. And as always, if you guys can take a minute of your time, head over to iTunes, or I guess Apple Podcasts now, leave our show a review. That goes a long way to helping people find us. I can tell you we've gotten enough reviews now. We're actually getting onto some of their lists, and also, like, if you like this show, you may also like things, and that really helps us out. It helps new people find us, which is the reason why we do this, is we want people to kind of discover us, and hopefully they enjoy what we do. But so far, you guys have just been tremendous in your feedback. We can't say enough good stuff. Once we wrap up our Blair Witch series, we're moving right on to Halloween. Not just the season, but also the series. All 11 movies. plus a lot of bonus goodies that we have lined up. That is Jerry's favorite movie of all time. It's one of my favorite franchises of all time. We're both really giddy to bring this to you, so we hope you guys love what we have in store. Once again, we will be looking forward to talking to you and bringing more of our show to you later on. Till then, we are out.